My name is Meredith Broussard. I am a data and computational journalism professor at New York University. And I would like to introduce you to our terrific panelists today. We have Pietro Passarelli, who is a product developer with a background in anthropology, documentary films, and computer science. We have Matthew Conlen, who is a PhD student in computer science at the Interactive Data Lab at University of Washington, and also builds tools for 538. Forrest Gregg is a partner at DataMade and a sociology student at University of Chicago with a background in machine learning and statistics. We also have Jean Cochrane, who is a developer at DataMade. Down at the end, we have Katharine, who is the journalism librarian at New York University, and we are going to have some really terrific presentations about new tools, and then we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A and some conversation about kind of issues around new tools in the newsroom. So Pietro, do you want to kick us off? Okay, thank you.
All right, so can you hear it?
It's he doesn't have it on.
Is it Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be talking about lessons learned from building tools in the newsroom. And first of all, I'll give you like a little bit of background about myself, because that kind of influences a lot of like my take on product development. So last year, I was an Mozilla Fellow with Open News Vox Media for 10 months, where I worked in with the product team on making video tools for the journalists. Prior to that, I have a mixed background. So I initially studied anthropology, then I got into documentary films. I worked in documentary production for the BBC for a bit, and then I got interested in that space where software and video converge, and I did a master in computer science. So the tool that I'm about to talk to you about, it's called AutoEdit, and it's for making video production faster, easier, more accessible. And in the first 3 months of its launch, it was downloaded about 700 times. And it's a desktop application for the Mac built with web technologies to make it more flexible. So you can basically let's go back a sec. You can basically give it a video or audio file, transcribes it for you using speech-to-text services like the IBM Watson. Then you see your selection that you can make on the transcription you see there can be exported as a video editing sequence. We'll go into more details on that. So basically, just to rewind a little bit, in terms of what is the problem that we're trying to solve here is, if you're working on a documentary or some kind of factual production, even news, where you got a bunch of video interviews or audio interviews, and this is kind of the question, how do you decide and how do you work? What is your process for making a story out of these interviews? So traditionally, people would be doing something like this. This is from a series of workshops that I run, which is titled how to craft compelling stories out of video interviews. But this is the analog paper editing workflow, where people would print out the interviews, papers, scissors, tape, loads of time, and basically just cut it out and decide what the story is. Very, very efficient for back in the days where people were using film and it would be time consuming to do otherwise, but not so much now where you're on tight deadlines. So it's kind of falling out of fashion. So the key features of my tools is that it takes about 5 minutes to do the transcriptions, regardless of the length of the media. It can support a bunch of different languages, like the one supported by IBM Watson in this case, and can work offline using some open source components. So you could be on a plane and you can still get a transcription. And you can also use it to export captions. But if you're interested in caption, come talk to me afterwards. I'm working on something that is specific for that, because this was not the intended use case for this tool. And then the key feature is, if you have different interviews with different transcription, you can make selection for multiple ones and basically they get drawn to the other side if you're looking at the screen right now, and then you can get a preview that shows you what your selection looks like before you export it into the video editing software of choice to continue with the editing. So the outcome is that it makes it faster. Like your video production becomes like a lot faster to do. The story crafting, you can make like more compelling stories out of it because you're working at the level of the content, at least when we're working on like video interviews, with video interviews. And then the collaboration, like because this tool sits right in between video producers and video editors. So there could be like a common like language to be discussing the story and the story elements. And you don't need a video editing software, at least to get to the rough cut stage of the video production process. So you can enable journalists and other people that maybe don't know how to use the video editing software to craft their story. So this is one of like the feedback that we got from the video producers, a box across the different brands. They were all very excited about it. So basically, like what I wanted to concentrate on is more in terms of like what are the lessons I learned from this. So first thing first, like user research in terms of like how do you get useful, actionable intel from your users, right? That's one of the biggest challenges when you're starting a new project. And I would urge you to think more in terms of like users' needs and less of technology stack. And then some of the things that I want to kind of like throw out there to think about are things like the lean methodology, and so the idea of like focusing on like the learning and the iteration and going towards a better understanding of the problem rather than getting straight to like a working solution. As well as like spending some time finding and identifying early adopters as like a key part of this process. And then like from the anthropological world, the idea of like participant observation. So if you can take some time to really immerse yourself with your users and learn about what they do, and maybe, you know, if it's like something is accessible to you, even do it yourself, you can learn a lot from that. There's this thing from the lean world called the MOM test, for example, where basically it's the idea that if you ask your questions in the past, you can get better predictor of future behavior. So instead of saying, would you use an app that does, you know, video editing, you ask, when is the last time you used it, what was that like, and so on. And that gives you more tangible things that you can use to move on with. Then, you know, if you're a domain expert in the area where you're doing the tools, that's fantastic. But if you're not, that's okay too. So what is a domain expert? Like a domain expert is someone that understands the complexity of a topic and can juggle the different contradictions of that topic in their mind when they're thinking and talking about it or acting in that space. As I said, if you're not a domain expert, that's fine. The point is, though, that you need to then start to think about what is your domain? Like, what are the boundaries of the domain? What are the expert views? So who are the experts in that domain? And that's, you know, through research. And once you figure that out, then you also have to think about how do your users feel about those views? Because, for example, in auto-edit, or the paper editing workflow that I just showed you, that, as I said, is something that is falling out of fashion, and it was, and it kind of is popular with producers and people, like journalists, people that are used to writing a lot. But if you show it to like a video editor, they're not going to want to do it because they're more visual and they want to work with sequences and images. And so you really need to kind of like think about these things. The other aspect that I think is important to think about is your users might not know what is best for them. They will know what is important for them, but I put here this quote that I got through, I think it was like a Slack message from one of the video producers who said, you know, it goes above and beyond what I thought was possible. And that is like a point that I used to make, that if I had tried to get just from the users the solution of what I was going to build for them, it would have not got as far as I did by going and looking at what is the domain and what are the expert views on it. Then from kind of the computer science world, looking at the mapping the problem domain is a useful technique to kind of move a little, not faster necessarily, but like being a little more flexible and a little more solid in your development. So if we took like the route planning example, like if you're doing like a route from A to B and you're doing all the extraction, then when you need to add like another route from A to C, you need to add all the other instructions. If you take some time instead to map what is like the chart domain and what are the different components and how does that behave, it's going to take a little longer to set up. But once you've set up, you're going to be able to do a lot more routes without having to do all the legwork to add them to it, because your problem and your code is going to scale and is going to move a lot. It's going to be a lot more flexible as the complexity and the requirements change over time. Again, from the computer science world, like using a components-based design approach can be like a very useful way of like being a lot like linear and faster when doing things, because you get components that can be reused, you can keep things modular, you can keep things small, and that can help you with like not being completely overwhelmed by the complexity of the problem and the technology that you're working with. This is my take on like what I think it's like an R&D approach. So once I'd done the user research, I went back to the users and I did like a bunch of workshops where I got people to do a paper edit workflow. And I got them to do it with like papers and scissors. I did not like wade straight into the technology. And then with that, I kind of got an understanding of like the strengths and weaknesses of the traditional analog workflow before trying to look into what would that look like as a digital workflow. Then as a digital workflow, I used, as you can see up here, that one is basically like a kind of mobile-first approach. And this was not meant to be like a mobile app, but using the technique of like mobile-first design allowed me to like really concentrate on like making things, like what are the key core requirements to put in there. Then using like low fidelity, high fidelity prototypes. The high fidelity one here is like a bootstrap, but it doesn't have any functionality to it. It's just to try out what would that look like before going into the actual development. Then two of like my closing points. One is the kind of idea that I want to urge you to think about is the kind of human versus machine type of situation. So in 1997, we had IBM Deep Blue that won like against like a human playing chess. And then in 2016, we had IBM Watson that was used to cut like a video tracer. Okay, let me wrap this up. So the point is, you need to think about like, is your tool meant to enhance the experience, or is your tool meant to like, yeah, let me just close that. So yeah, convenience trumps quality every day of the week. So you need to think about the convenience hook that you want to use so that you can get people to use your tool, and then, yeah, that's it.
Next up, we have Matthew Conlen. All right, we need multiple text board up here. Oh, there we go.
Hi everybody. I'm going to be talking today about Idyll, which is a new programming language that I've been working on. I'm at the University of Washington currently. I'm in the second year of my PhD working under Heer at the Interactive Data Lab there. They're responsible for a lot of web-based data visualization tools. And prior to that, and still currently, but part-time, I work as a computational journalist at 538, which means I build internal tools for them and work on stories and graphics, things like that. One thing that's kind of interesting about this project and its formation is that it's something that I think the idea wouldn't have been formulated without years of time spent working in a newsroom, and it's also something that I never could have built in a newsroom. So it's kind of this weird thing where I had to get out to make some progress. So just kind of a high level, Idyll is a tool for building rich narrative interactive stories. So the types of things that you see on 538, the types of things that you see on the Upshot, kind of Brett Victor style Magic Ink pieces is kind of the inspiration for it and the targeted design space for what we want to enable people to build. And the way that it achieves that goal is by starting with what I call a compile to the web markup language, and I'll get into that in a second, that really focuses on orchestrating between just static text and dynamic interactive JavaScript components, making sure that those things play really nicely together, which is something that's lacking from a lot of other current tools. On top of that, Idyll includes a reactive variable system, which means that if you have a variable in your document and a reader changes it or turns a knob or flips a switch, then that change immediately propagates to everything else in your document. So everything is live. And it also understands kind of a reader's progression through the article. So if you want to say, fire off an event when a reader gets to a certain section or progresses X% through something, then you can do that as well. That's kind of a lot, but I'll show you more concretely what I mean. So compile to the web language. We start with just standard Markdown, actually, to begin with. So an Idyll file is a text file. You run it through the program, and out comes a full web page. So all HTML, JavaScript, everything bundled together. The reason for doing it this way was that really I know that as journalists and as people who care about the presentation of their material online, you're very concerned with kind of like making sure that when you're writing, there's a reasonable experience for that. Nobody wants to go into an actual HTML page and edit the documents, which is sometimes what you end up doing if you're kind of operating in the interactive world, which oftentimes sort of goes around the CMS. So like, because these things are so custom, you can't use WordPress a lot of the time. The New York Times solves this problem with something called ArchieML, which takes almost the exact opposite approach that Idyll does. So instead of kind of starting with text and adding interactivity to it, they say start with custom JavaScript, but make sure that there's a really good way to like include copy edited text in there. So we want to be able to orchestrate text and interactive components. So let's see. Okay, so top few lines are simply text, and then we have something in brackets here, which corresponds to an interactive component, which gives you something like what you see on the right. So, you're going through an article and there's just text, but there's no reason to stop there. Like we want to enable you to include custom charts, dynamic graphics, things like that. This is an example from a piece we have online about trigonometry. So it's kind of showing how cosines and sines are represented. And this is kind of the way in which we expose like this layer between JavaScript and text. Just making sure that you can invoke custom JavaScript components very easily and parameterize them with these reactive variables. So here's another example. So now, not only do we have a custom component, but we have a variable that drives it. So that means that a reader can interact with something on the page, and then that variable can cause propagations throughout the document and make things change. So on the left, we have some simple markup, which declares a variable, makes like a range slider, and then draws a sine wave chart. And the range slider is bound to the variable, which we call frequency. So as soon as you go and scrub along that slider, the chart will automatically update because it depends on that variable. So here's that in action. Right, so you get text, you get input components, and visual output. And this whole thing fits on the slide like this. And so what you're seeing here are two kind of built-in components. So all of the kind of standard things that you would expect to be able to use, buttons, checkboxes, sliders, basic charts are included, but we also let you write your own custom components as well and include those very easily. So again, we understand where you are in the article. So this means that you can parameterize things not only based on variables, but also based on position in the page. And not only can you directly parameterize things, but you can also fire events. So say something like, when element A enters the reader's viewport, I want action B to happen. Here's an example using that. So this is an example created by Ricky Reusser, who's an engineer at Plotly. He works on kind of WebGL JavaScript components for the web. This is an article that he made with Idyll. And basically, it's showing kind of airflow around an airplane wing. And you can see there's kind of a big header, just kind of standard text, and then we get to this like feature section here. And then as you scroll, the WebGL graphic in the background is parameterized by the scrolling. And so this thing is built with all just kind of out-of-the-box components, except for this one that he added, which is a WebGL thing on top of it. And so why should you care? I claim that this is pretty powerful. We can recreate a lot of the design space that journalists are looking at, and these pieces are currently very expensive to make, oftentimes prohibitively expensive if you're a small newsroom. It works really well with other JavaScript libraries. So if you use D3, if you use 3JS or something like that, it'll fit right into your existing workflow. And yeah, these examples are all online. I'll show a link at the end. It's efficient, so there's much less code involved because we kind of take a look at what the common things are that people often do in these types of stories and built a set of abstractions that reduce a lot of the boilerplate code. So you're not going to write things that listen for scroll events, and you're not going to write things that bind variables and do state management or anything like that. You're basically going to write your text, and you're going to parameterize your components based on what the reader does. And finally, there's a growing community of people using the tool. So since it was released as open source software in April, it's got like 14 or 15,000 downloads now. There's a bunch of people contributing to it on GitHub. And the first piece actually by a Newsroom, a nonprofit, is in the works with it. I can't really talk about it yet, but it's a thing that's happening, which is cool. And yeah, thank you. So here's links again. Sorry, thanks. Yeah, here's links if anyone, oh, they're all weird. Idyllang.org is the thing. Right.
Great. So next we have Jean from DataMade, and let's see if we can make this work this time. All right, come back, mouse. Where'd you go? Here we go. Yeah.
Cool.
All right, we did it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Gene Cochrane. I work with DataMade, which is a civic technology company in Chicago. My colleague Forrest Gregg is on the panel now. And I also want to give a shout out to Tim McGovern, who is sitting in the back there, works in the digital humanities space. We've all been thinking together about this thing that we call machine-assisted dossiers for about the past couple of months. And Forrest and I approach it from one specific angle, given that we do a lot of work with advocacy organizations and journalists who are working in the public accountability space. But Tim comes at it from a different angle. He comes out of a digital humanities background and probably has some totally different things to say about it. So if you're interested in what I talk about here, I would encourage you to go talk to him and come talk to us, of course. in this kind of space of public accountability, which is, whether you are researching like security forces, or if you're researching a police department, or if you want to figure out who is donating money to a political campaign, a persistent problem that comes up in organizations that are doing this kind of research is that you have to maintain a dossier of people and of organizations and of hierarchies of authority. And you have to use that. You want to maintain that dossier for your own internal research. You also want to be able to share it among people on your team so that they can get something out of it too. And then in a lot of these cases, you also want to be able to release it to the general public so that they, for example, an advocacy organization wants to make a case to the general public. A journalist has a story to tell about an incident that involves a security force. And one thing that comes up, and the problem that is recurring here, is that in standard research methods, the work you do is very private. So often you're collecting files, you have many different documents in a Google Drive, and it makes a lot of sense to you. It has a lot of flexibility for you. You're able to kind of move and change quickly, which is great, but then that doesn't translate in any kind of easy way to the public. So often you have to write a story. If you're a journalist, you want to release that. If you're an advocacy organization, you have to hire someone, in many cases, to help you tell that story to the public. So we've been thinking about that tension, and it comes up over and over, and we're convinced that there are better ways to design tools that will allow you to kind of keep track of this information while also making it generalizable to the public. So in surveying the landscape of existing research tools, I think the most common ones look something like this. They're often analog. Sometimes they're not analog, but they're kind of conspiratorial in the way that they feel. You're collecting things, you're indexing things, you're drawing connections between things, but it's all in this kind of like metaphorical blackboard or bulletin board where you really have to do a lot of work to explain to people what's going on there. There are some digital tools like Scrivener that kind of work out of this metaphorical system, but are still porting those same ways of thinking about research and of thinking about being an investigator, and they're persisting the problem of making it hard to communicate that information to other people. I think another set of tools that is kind of in the opposite direction, that really prioritizes the collective benefit of information, is wikis. And wikis tend to feel a lot like this. They feel empty. There's often a lot of initial energy that goes into making a wiki, and then it stagnates because it's really hard to do. And if you're in the middle of an investigation, there's not a lot of immediate benefit to keeping up with the wiki and putting all the information that you're collecting in there. It's just not flexible enough often for the things that you want to do. Ideally, we want to design a tool that's like an exoskeleton, where it is fit to the contours of your body, to the contours of your work, and where it feels natural in the kinds of things that you're thinking about and the domains that you're working in. So the particular domain that we've been working the most in is in security forces. We've been working with an organization called Security Force Monitor out of Columbia University. And they track security forces around the world. They collect public data primarily in the form of news reports, and then they create organizational hierarchies of security forces that are involved in human rights violations around the world. And in this kind of research, we see two levels of inference that seem to persist across these types of domains. So one level of work and of inference is in the collection of documents. So you're getting news reports. If you were an organization with more funding, you might be doing OCR on a large batch of news reports that you're scraping from somewhere, and then you're indexing them for interesting keywords and things that you might want to think about later. Then there's another layer of work that is a little bit more nebulous, but that's crucial to this kind of task, and that's managing the claims and the evidence that you're working with. So you're taking the index documents you have, the news reports, and you're saying, okay, so John Smith was the commander of this organization at this moment in time when a human rights violation was committed. And the crucial thing that we think is going on here is that both of those are types of inferences. They're both claims that are being made about the world, but they're being made in different ways. In one of them, you're defining the domain of, in the collection, you're defining the domain of things that is interesting to you. And in the claim making, in the management of the evidence, you're actually making an argument about that. And so one thing that strikes us about the existing research space is that there's a lot of great tools for doing that first lower level of collecting documents. I think OCR is really powerful now. Scraping is pretty accessible to a lot of people. So we've kind of figured out, okay, if we have a lot of information and we want to index it, we can get computers to do that for us, and it's awesome. But the secondary step of taking all of that information that we have and of making claims about it and then being able to share those claims to people and share with them the reasons why we think that they're true and the sources that lead us to believe that, that's a little bit more nebulous now, and that's kind of the thing that we're interested in pushing on here with the idea of a machine-assisted dossier. So in looking at the existing tool space, I think actually the most powerful example of something like this that exists in the world is FamilySearch.org, which is a genealogy tool made by the Church of Latter-day Saints. And the goal is to use census records to track the genealogies of everyone in the world. And they do a really amazing job of balancing these competing interests of private research and public benefit of data. So here you can see one of the easy, fast, and great things you can do is you can browse many different types of entities. Here we have James Bonha. You can see lots of vital information about him. And on the right-hand side there, you can also see this research help box, which is pointing out to you things that the computer thinks might be true about this person. And scattered throughout the genealogical tool, there are all kinds of different callouts to help you figure out where you should want to do more work, conflicts that might be arising between the information that you've already logged. Here you can see that you can actually look at sources. This is a United States Census from 1930, and these are all of the entities that the system thinks are tied to that source. And if you want to, you can go in much deeper. You can see the scanned version of the document, and you can audit all of the types of events and people that were extracted from this document, whether it was by a machine or by a staff member at Family Search or by a volunteer. And this is the kind of thing that we dream of in the space of doing research in public accountability. Is we want to be able to collect this type of information. We want to be able to work quickly. We want to be able to change our idea about what the world looks like in a very fast and flexible way. But we also want our colleagues to get benefit out of that, and we want the public to get benefit out of that. So the levels of inference that involve collecting documents and indexing documents, I think those are really strong now. But what we're really interested in is pushing the frontier of that to managing claims and evidence as well, and integrating it all into one system that makes sense for the individual journalist and investigator, but also makes sense for the public at large. Thanks.
Oh. Dearly departed slide. All right, let's see if we can get the other presentation up. All right, so Katie and I are going to talk about our most recent project. Our goal is not at all ambitious. We are trying to save data journalism. We are not trying to save it from the industry side. We'll save that for other people. But rather, we are trying to save it for the future. We're interested in data journalism down the road, and will future scholars be able to look at the data journalism that's being produced today? I got interested in this problem because I've been writing for the web for a really long time. I think I published my first thing professionally on the web in about 1996, and all of my early stuff is gone. It's gone. Companies went under, companies changed ownership, companies changed their CMSs, and I have a very comprehensive archive of my work, of everything I've written professionally in my entire life, and it's all printed out. and it sits in my apartment in archival boxes. So you'd imagine that as a data journalist, as a digital journalist, that I would have this like incredibly comprehensive digital personal archive, but I do not. The most efficient way that I've found to keep my work is in print in my apartment. So I started thinking, well, what is happening to other people's work? And in 20 years, in 50 years, are scholars going to be able to look back at data journalism and understand what we were doing as journalists? And no, they probably won't, honestly, unless we come up with some better preservation methods now.
So I'm Katie Boss, Katharine Boss is my full name. Meredith and I are colleagues at NYU, and she wrote a fascinating paper on this when she first came to NYU, and I read it. And librarians, I'm the librarian for journalism at NYU. Librarians are thinking about this all the time. Thank you. We are constantly thinking about how to save all the amazing things that you guys are building. And the problem is that everything that you're building now, there is no systemic, holistic way for any library or cultural institution to save it. There's nothing. It's really horrifying. And these projects are disappearing now. A lot of them already have. There are a couple of different reasons why this is happening, like why are we losing all of these things. And it's not a new problem. Every time, historically this has happened many times. Every time there is a new media format that comes out, the new media precipitates a way to archive and preserve it. It happened with radio, it happened with television, it happened with the original print newspapers. And it's happening again with data journalism. The things that you guys are building rely on very complex stacks of technology in order to fully function and display. And in order to save these things and have them work 50 years in the future when there's been a huge technology shift, we have to have saved all of those software dependencies, which is known as dependency hell. And I'm sure you guys have all encountered this before. So libraries are just now starting to think about how are we going to address this problem. Newsrooms don't think about this so much. And I'm seeing a lot of like nods and recognition in the audience. Newsrooms are focused on the future. You're focused on gaining an audience and profitability and monetizing things. You're not so much looking backward and preserving the things that you've already built. So the monetary incentive to do this is low, and it falls to libraries, and we don't have a lot of money. So this is kind of some of the problems that we're facing. And the stuff that you're building now is the fragile ephemera of our time. This is an early news app from 2009 from the Washington Post. And this is what it looks like now. None of the interactive features are functioning anymore. You'll notice we have circled there that you have to update your Flash in order to view this news application.
By the way, Flash, Adobe has announced that they're not going to support it anymore or update it after 2020. So all of you who have made awesome Flash graphics through the years, you have 3 years. That's it. Then they just won't work anymore. So consider yourself warned.
This is happening all over the place. This was a famous Philadelphia Inquirer story, Black Hawk Down. None of the interactive features or videos in this news application work anymore. I believe this one was from 1997. It was a really early, cutting-edge interactive news story. So this is the fate of all of the projects that you're building 10 years from now. It's a problem that we're hoping everybody is really going to start caring about and focusing on, because these are your legacies. And for posterity, we have to figure out a way to address this problem.
So usually when I talk about archiving, actually when both of us talk about archiving, somebody says, well, what about the Internet Archive? Have you looked at their tools? Doesn't the Internet Archive preserve everything? And we always say yes. The Internet Archive does a great job And we love their tools. There are lots of terrific preservation tools out there. In fact, I just learned about another one this morning called Perma, which is designed to combat link rot. And yes, we need solutions to all of these problems. The problem of preserving news apps is slightly different than the problem of preserving web pages or of preserving links. Okay, so we need to be working on all of these different problems simultaneously. News apps are an interesting case because they are databases, right? So a news app is a front-end interface on a database, and it allows the user to kind of put themselves into the story to find their own context. Data visualizations are their own kind of complicated, complex things, and they're all highly idiosyncratic, which is great for innovation purposes, but makes it really difficult to standardize preservation.
So this is a news app from ProPublica. How much is a limb worth? It was an interesting sort of data visualization about workman's comp and how much money they get for if they injure themselves in a particular state. So this is what it looks like if you go to the website today. This is what it looks like in the Internet Archive. This is the crawled static version of that site. So a lot of the functionality just cannot be captured by web crawlers. The Internet Archive is doing amazing work. They've been doing amazing work since 1994, but you guys are building things too fast and too furious for them to keep up. It's just you're advancing at a much faster rate than the archiving and crawling technology is advancing, and a crawler will never be able to capture a database. So we run into a problem.
One way of thinking about it is that you could put a text page into a database, but you can't put a database into a database. So our goal is to create a scholarly archive of data journalism. The same way that we have scholarly archives of print news, we'd like to capture data journalism projects, put them into a scholarly archive, add metadata, and make them searchable and discoverable for future generations. So our first step in creating this scholarly archive was saying, all right, what's out there? Because we can't figure out what we need to build until we know what other people have built. So we undertook to conduct a survey of data journalists to find out what are the projects that you think need preservation and what is the technology stack that you're using to build these projects. So our findings. We have preliminary findings. The survey is still open, by the way. So if there are any data journalists here who would like to take the survey, we really want your data. We want you to take the survey. It shouldn't take more than a few minutes. We want to hear about how your projects are built. One of the things we discovered was that documentation for all of these projects is minimal. All right, we all do a really great job. We work really hard on building these projects, but then we don't document them. And so it's really hard to figure out how they're made, so we need to document a little bit better. What we discovered in terms of the technology that people are using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, D3, Python, Rails, Flask, and Django. There's some other idiosyncratic stuff in there, but this is kind of where people's technology stack is right now. Where is the code is another question we asked, because the preservation technology that we are using comes from reproducible science. And we are trying to figure out a way to do back-end preservation as opposed to just front-end preservation. So the Internet Archive crawls the front end of a website. We want to do both front-end and back-end preservation for holistic preservation. So we needed to think about where is the code. And let me just flip back for 1 second. So when the site is visible to you, the code actually sits on a server somewhere. And so news organizations have their code stored in lots of different places. It's primarily on Google Cloud, on Bitbucket, or at AWS. In a couple of places, or a couple of instances, the code is sitting on a physical computer that is underneath somebody's desk somewhere. So there are all these stories in data journalism of like sites that were really well trafficked, and then all of a sudden they went down, and people started freaking out. And it turned out that the site was actually running on a computer under somebody's desk, and that person had to like move desks, and so they unplugged the computer to like move across the newsroom, and like everything went all haywire. So, you know, these are very human considerations. So, like, we need to find out, like, is your code on AWS? Is it on server under somebody's desk? And that's going to affect our preservation methods.
So we're doing this survey. We've been tweeting about it. We put it on the NICAR list. We're trying to disseminate it in a lot of different ways. Please take the survey if you've been building news applications. Like, the more we know about the stuff that you build, the better tool that we can build to archive it, capture it, preserve it. So I think an important thing to note is that once we do get the results of the survey, we have a team that we're working with at NYU, part of the engineering team, and they've developed this tool called ReproZip that comes from the computational reproducibility field. And if we get enough grant money, we're going to try and build something that will fit in with the workflows of data journalists so that you can make archiving a part of the process of building a news application. So that at the end of something that you've built, you'll be able to archive it. And the important thing here is that it will fall upon data journalists. Traditionally, the way the Internet Archive archives digital journalism, born digital news stories, is that they crawl things, and there really doesn't have to be any buy-in from the newsrooms themselves. This is going to have to be different because we're trying to capture things on the server side. The reason why we're doing this is also a huge shift in libraries. We're trying to emulate the entire software environment. Trying to capture everything, all of the software dependencies that were used to build that particular thing, and then take that little file and archive that. And then in the future, somebody 50 years from now can run that again on a virtual machine. So that it'll have the same look, it'll have the same feel, it'll have the same full functionality. There's no way to do this right now, but that's what we're trying to do. This is what we're hoping for with this archive of data journalism projects. I think that's about it. Thank you so much.
All right, how do we get back to the neutral slide here?
I think you're there.
You're there.
All right. We'll just look at that for a little while. Okay, perfect. All right, so we have some time for questions. Do we have questions from the audience, first off? Or I can start with some of my questions. Justin.
Hey there. Thanks, everybody, for all the stuff that you were presenting. I sort of want to follow up on the on this archiving topic, since that was the most recent one. And I'm sort of wondering where we can or should draw the line when it comes to these projects we make that potentially depend on external services. So I'm thinking of all of the stuff that people are doing around analyzing Twitter feeds in real time or other things of that sort, right? The Facebook work that the Wall Street Journal did around red feed, blue feed. I mean, obviously we get into some hairy legal issues if we start just trying to mirror all of that as well. So I'm wondering sort of what strategies you might recommend for things like that.
The problem of how to deal with news applications that depend on streaming data is really the hardest question in terms of archiving. I'm going to be perfectly frank, we are kicking that down the road. We're solving the easy questions first, or the easiest questions first. So an easier question might be, all right, how can we preserve something like a news app that depends on Idyll? that is a lot easier than dealing with, all right, how do we preserve this news app that is dependent on streaming data? So we're just going to do one thing at a time. And hopefully we'll know a lot more by the time we get through Idyll. Great. More questions? Yep, up at the top.
It's interesting to hear each of you talk about users and being clear about kind of journalists being the users that I think use most of your tools. How do you be super clear that it is that audience, it's not a consumer-facing play? And how do you kind of measure up the size of what that reach is ever going to be? I think so many tools that get targeted at a specific newsroom base kind of max out at a certain number of people because there's only so many people who could possibly use the video tool at Vox. How do you size, what would be success of the tool you've built around video editing? I guess for anybody, sorry to throw it a little vague.
Yeah, obviously you need to define some kind of metrics of what are your goals and what's your vision with the tool. Obviously when I was pitching the tool at the beginning to the product team, I was saying it will consider speed up video production. They were like, what does that mean? What is considered? They were like, it would half the time. Whatever. You try to figure out what is a quantitative measure. Qualitative measures are a lot harder to estimate and do. For me, the kind of measure of success was, let's try to have an organic growth of the tool. So let's start with a few users, and then let's see if those users spread the words to other people, and then if those people come back and are like, oh, I heard about this, can I have the IBM keys so that I can install it or whatever, then that's for me is a measure that it's working. People are talking about it to other people, and they're continuing to use it, and so on. If it went just quiet and nobody's asking me about it, nobody's reporting bugs, nobody's asking to join the sort of groups of people using it, then not so much. There's stuff that needs to be tweaked. So that's kind of a very lean approach to how to measure if it's getting growth, I guess.
Yeah, I think there are also some differences with kind of where you're coming from with the creation of the tool. For me, I do a lot of open source software. So if it helps some small subset of people, then that's enough. I'm not trying to get rich off of it exactly. So I think there's probably a very different answer to your question if you're coming at it from a for-profit side versus a nonprofit side as well.
We're a consulting company, so if our client is happy, then we've done our job. But I also think that if we are actually able to solve some of the problems that we're working on at DataMade, you would have also have solved to a large extent the problems of customer relationship management, which is a billion-dollar industry. I'm not saying that's our next move, but I'm saying that yeah, but the kind of the problems of journalists are the problems of knowledge workers, of which there are many who are not journalists, and that if you're actually really able to find tools that really solve a problem in journalism, you probably also have found a problem that has a lot of scale.
Yeah, actually, for example, I've had a lot of educators reach out to me about Idyll, in particular about interactive textbooks and things like that, if that's another application of it. So I think, I totally agree with your point there, that a lot of problems in journalism are applicable across industries.
I think that when you're developing tools for journalists, it's a different thing than developing tools that are designed to be used at scale. So as a writer, you can't write for everybody everywhere. You have to write for a very small and distinct audience. And it's really helpful to kind of imagine an ideal reader and just write to that ideal reader. And in product design, you do something similar, right? You have your kind of, your emblematic users. I forget what they're called.
Like the personas.
Yeah, you have your personas. And then after you've made the product, often you do find all these other fantastic uses for it. But I think you also have to be prepared for the possibility that nobody's ever going to use your tech. You know, I mean, you have to be prepared for your technology to be totally ignored. Just like when you write, you have to be prepared for nobody to ever read it. And, you know, you just like keep going anyway.
So I had a question just around the role that, so just a question I guess posed to Meredith and Katharine, our answer, like what's the role of, how would you go about prioritizing different kinds of knowledge artifacts in the work that you're doing? So like would you, the answer is going to be both of course, but why or how can we think about like prioritizing the final artifact, like the written story, the thing on the website versus a lot of data journalists now are using these tools like Jupyter Notebooks or notebooks in general that kind of document how they went about doing the analysis and have all the code that generated these analyses, these charts and things like that. And so like what role do those kinds of, that infrastructure, that layer below the final artifact play and how you think about archiving the work of data journalists and things like that? Or how should we think about prioritizing those kinds of, the work of generating the final artifact?
How about we just take your work and we do that first? That'd be a good way of prioritizing. So how are we thinking about this? Well, Katie, do you want to talk a little bit about our first project, our ProPublica project?
Yeah, we could talk about that and documentation related to it. Librarians have to think about this a lot too, like how do you rank what you want to preserve? Because librarians always want to save everything, and there just isn't, there's not time, there's not space, there's not money. Ideally, you would have all of the documentation kept as well in some sort of a archive, special archive related to the organization or the person, if they become a famous data journalist. We've been working with ProPublica in New York City to start trying to archive one of their news applications. And it doesn't pull from an external API, so we started with something kind of easy, with some success.
Yeah, it's hard. One of the things we discovered was that the tool we were using, which is a reproducible science tool, it encapsulates the code, data, and server environment of the scientific experiment, preserves it along with some metadata. It's great for things that don't have external files, but if you have a news app that has front-end files on a different server, then guess what, it doesn't work. So we have to kind of amend it so that it works, so that we can fully preserve one app. Once we have fully preserved one app, we will go on to take what we learned, do another one, and then generalize those findings, and then go on to kind of make a larger scale agenda after that. Okay. Do we have time for one more?
I think time for one more.
Okay.
And yes, here we go.
Also had a question for Katharine and for Meredith, and actually echoing a little bit of what Brian was just asking about. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, so I'm poking the bear a little bit and playing devil's advocate. But you made a compelling argument for preserving content and preserving as much depth in the content as you can possibly archive. My question is why? And by that I mean, are there some limits on how much we should be preserving and how much content we should be attempting to archive and store? How much of a newspaper should we be saving and preserving? Are there limits, and are we reaching limits on how much digital content we can save? And that is largely the decision that the Internet Archive has made. We can't get everything. We will prioritize and get as much as we can. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think that it's got to be a group effort, because one person can't do it all. To put it all in the Internet Archive is too much. Ideally, this would be a cooperative effort between a lot of different universities, and we could all be collecting stuff that is built locally in our area. So, UCLA could be doing the LA Times, and we could be doing the New York Times at NYU, and between everybody, we would have an archived version of it somewhere. That's how libraries operate now. The local library in any town is going to archive hopefully, to the first issue of your local town newspaper all the way back to the very beginning. Nobody else has that, but the local area library will. And if everybody was joining in to do this, this is completely manageable. This is not a problem. All we need is the way to do it and some standards and the tools. And well, most importantly, we need cooperation from the newsrooms themselves.
And maybe we can also sneak in some machine dossiers
Totally.
and a little bit of video here and there. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been a pleasure.